Continuing our conversation from last time, I want to delve a bit into the early modern period. Again, this is the 16th and 17th and maybe early 18th centuries. The chronology isn't as important, I think, as some of these ideas and templates of communities that are put into place in this era. And some of these, have their first appearance in the Middle Ages. So we're not strictly demarcating like time divisions here necessarily, but dealing with the rise of certain institutions that are very influential on Thomas More, on Francis Bacon, on other things that come later, right? The first and maybe most important of these to mention is this intellectual tradition called humanism. And to try to characterize humanism briefly is difficult, okay? But maybe by way of contrast, it would be somewhat more clear than if we were just trying to take it on its own terms. During the Middle Ages, the Christian worldview obviously was dominant, and the human being was seen as a fallen creature in a world dominated by God, and that there was this gap between God and humanity, right? That in some ways humans, were just sort of pawns in the playing out of this cosmic conflict between God and the devil. The focus really was not on human beings. Now, that's not entirely the case always. Scholars have identified the roots of humanism well back into the 11th and 12th centuries and perhaps even earlier. But suffice it to say that there is an increased emphasis starting in the 14th and 15th centuries especially on the human being as a subject of study, and even a great optimism about the capabilities of human beings, okay? And I think that this is maybe the most important characteristic of humanism, right? It's this idea that the human being, if we understand the human being, we can understand the universe. The human being is a kind of microcosm of the entire universe, right? The human being is the pinnacle of God's creation. The human is the only one of God's creations created actually in the image of God himself or itself, right? And there are a number of works from this period that celebrate the human being as an object worthy of study and worthy of understanding, and kind of celebrating and contemplating the capabilities of humans. Particularly important would be things like there's a humanist scholar in the 15th century named Giovanni Pico della Mirandola in Florence who writes this work called The Oration on the Dignity of Mankind, right? The dignity is, I think, the important thing, and he delves into this idea of the human being is, endowed with free will and created in the image of God and all of this. Some have tried to set up humanism as a secular counterpart to the Christianity that dominated the Middle Ages. It's really not that. It's just as religious in its own way, but it elevates the human being to an important subject within the broader kind of Christian worldview. Thomas More was taken with humanism. He was among a circle of humanist scholars in Northern Europe that included such luminaries as Erasmus of Rotterdam, and they carried out correspondences with each other for many decades and kind of, wrote these works and sought each other's opinion of these kinds of things, right? So More is deeply involved in this. Another factor, it's not so much a model of community or thinking about community, but another major factor that we have to appreciate in this period is the growth of the printing press. The first printing press in Europe is developed in Western Germany, the city of Mainz, in the 1450s. It's attributed to Johann Gutenberg, but there are actually a couple of different printing shops that started in that period with movable type printing. And this made it so that books could be made much more easily. Previous to this time, books had to be handwritten. They had to be made. They had to be handwritten on materials, parchment specifically, which is animal skin, that would take an incredibly long time and great expense to produce. And so even the greatest libraries in the medieval Christian world had only a few hundred, maybe a couple of thousand works total in their entire library, right? And they only devoted their time writing things that they thought were absolutely essential. And this was especially true for things like theological texts, right? So with the rise of the printing press, books could be produced much more quickly and cheaply and in just exponentially greater volume. And so things like, this is a great Baroque library in Germany, I believe. And actually, I'm not sure where that's at. I apologize. I should have looked that up again. This kind of library only becomes possible with the printing press, where a single library at an institution like a monastery or at one of the rising universities of this period could have thousands or even tens of thousands or conceivably hundreds of thousands of individual volumes of books, and humanist scholars and others could pursue the world's knowledge this way, and get their ideas out there because they were able to print them so much more easily. The number of books, meaning physical books, that were produced from 1450 to 1500 exceeded that the output of the previous 1,000+ years. That's how dramatically the printing press transformed things. And so if we, read a work like Utopia, we have to know that this was printed. This was published in the year 1516 and put out in fairly large numbers. Books previous to this time would be produced in single copies, or maybe just a few copies that would be given to wealthy people as gifts to seek their patronage and things, right? With the printing press, people could buy books and even have personal libraries for fairly little money, or relatively little money at least, right? Well, the major factor in utopian thinking and thinking about communities in this period is the discovery, at least from the European perspective. Of course, many people were already living here, and it's not really discovered to them, but the European encounter, we might say, with the New World. And once this was acknowledged, Christopher Columbus never thought he had found a new continent. He died thinking he had made it to the eastern reaches of Asia. But once it was acknowledged by Amerigo Vespucci and others that this was in fact a different place, and they began to map this and see the extent of it, well, this excited the European imagination and got people thinking about, what are the possibilities there, right? Utopia itself, as we'll see, is placed by Thomas More. It's a fictional place, obviously, but it's, he locates this in the New World. It's an island somewhere off the coast of South America. And it's not a real place, it's fictional, but the very idea that, something could exist out there in this heretofore unknown land, right, lent itself to a great deal of optimism, I think. And to thinking about comparing European society with these newly found places or newly encountered places, right? And the initial European response was that these people were savages or barbarians, or they were not civilized. But some thinkers, like More for one, but also like Michel de Montaigne is one who comes to mind, started to kind of question the ethics of Europe by comparing them to these peoples they encountered in the New World. To say that, are we actually more civilized? Let's look at what they're doing. Let's look at the problems we have, and maybe they've got solutions that we haven't contemplated, or models that we could draw on. So the New World is a really important kind of, piece of the European mental furniture in this period. Francis Bacon locates New Atlantis, again, a fictional place, in the middle of the Pacific. So even, more than a century on from the first encounters with the New World, they're still thinking about the possibilities of these undiscovered places. Another concept to be aware of here is the development of what we call the sovereign state. This is the idea that the state, and this is so natural to us that I think, have a hard time even, contemplating something that would have been different. But the idea that within the borders of a state, meaning what we would call a nation, although that term really can't be applied exactly to the political entities of this period, but that the government is sovereign, that it has the ability to reach its laws and its governance and its enforcement of laws into every part of that land within those borders, right? And that the state itself has a monopoly on the exercise of force and the enforcement of laws and such, right? And this takes a couple of different paths. In some places, we have the rise of parliaments, and I mean monarchies are common all over Europe, but they are of different natures. Even a single monarch who might rule over multiple lands would have different terms of rule in different lands. A good example is Charles V, the Emperor of Germany at the beginning of the 16th century. He was the emperor over lands mostly in what is now Germany and Austria, but he was also the king of Spain. He was also the ruler of what was called the Spanish Netherlands, which was most of what we now know as the Low Countries. And with the Spanish claims on the New World, he was also master of much of Central and South America. So this is a vast space, but the terms of his rule were different in Germany than they were in Spain or in Austria or in the New World for that matter, right? And in some cases, especially England, the monarchs were checked in their power by the rise of powerful parliaments, and some of that dates back to the 13th and 14th centuries. But the parliamentary tradition in England was continuing apace in the 16th and 17th centuries. This later leads to conflict with what we call the English Civil War in the 17th century. In France, and to some extent in Spain after Charles V, when his son Philip II takes over as King of Spain, we have more of an absolutist government where the king is seen as the authority, right? This culminates, of course, in the 18th century, or the late 17th and early 18th centuries with King Louis XIV in France, the Sun King, as he's called, who is famously said, l'état c'est moi, the state it is I, or I am the state, maybe is a better translation of that, right? And so, some countries are trending toward more of an absolutist system of government, others toward a kind of shared system of governments between monarchies and parliaments. In Italy, we have these powerful city-states who use their economic might to remain independent and to, exist as sort of small superstates in their own right. So the Republic of Venice, the Republic of Florence, of Genoa, of Milan, the Duchy of Milan, I should say. But some parts of Italy were intertwined with other kingdoms, like Naples, for instance, was at various times under the control of Spanish kings or French kings or whatever. So these Italian city-states, maybe most importantly during what we call the Italian Renaissance, were centers of creativity, places where the wealth produced by the merchants of these cities, who were some of the wealthiest people in all of the world at the time, were put to use in creating art and architecture and experimenting with things. And from this comes a kind of model of partnership between the merchants and the intellectuals, which itself is really attractive to humanists and others. Thomas More is aware of this, Bacon's aware of this, and others, right? And finally, a final theme that we should discuss briefly is kind of this tension between union on the one hand, where there is a desire to unite things politically and religiously, and then the growth of fragmentation in this period, right? A good example of union would be the political union under Charles V of much of Europe, though when Charles, was close to death, he decided that it would be wise to break up his kingdom into two main parts. He gave his son Philip Spain and the Netherlands and the New World, and turned the empire of Central Europe over to his brother, Ferdinand, and this is part of the kind of early Habsburg dynasty in what is now Austria and Germany. And so, even Charles V saw that union was not really possible because the traditions of different regions were such that his status as ruler was fragmented, right? So union and fragmentation exist in tension. The greatest example of fragmentation, the most important one certainly, is the religious fragmentation that comes with the Protestant Reformation. And Thomas More is right in the middle of this, but that's actually after he writes Utopia. He later becomes Chancellor of England and then has a falling out with Henry VIII over the question of the breakaway of the Church of England from the Catholic Church. More was a devout Catholic and saw this as heresy, and was imprisoned and eventually executed for that, for defying the king in that matter. And so, the religious fragmentation begun with Martin Luther and then spreading to all of these early reformers, where parts of Europe then become Protestant, others remain Catholic. There's a lot of war in this period over the question of religion. And that is animating the thought processes of the period. Francis Bacon is writing his work during the early stages of the 30 Years' War, which didn't affect England so much as the continent, but he would have been aware of these religious conflicts going on there. And then, this other thing that brings about both union and fragmentation is the growth of science, right? And, maybe most notably the theories of Nicholas Copernicus, who suggests that the sun is the center of the universe rather than the earth, and continuing into the 17th century with figures like Kepler and Galileo. Francis Bacon himself has been called the father of empiricism, this idea that observation ought to govern scientific inquiry, that we ought to look at things and examine things and collect data as part of our process of discovery, right? So Bacon is intimately involved in this and an important figure in his own right. And this influences the way that he thinks. The growth of science, the sharing of ideas led to the creation of these kind of networks of intellectuals. And that network of intellectuals is, what kind of the model that Bacon has in mind in writing The New Atlantis. All right, so hopefully that wasn't too complicated. That gives us the ability to make some sense of these works. If you have questions, please bring them up in discussion board or in class. Would love to continue this discussion with you. Thanks.